Tim, you're a doctor in the field of metabolics, which is how the study of our bodies use energy. What's the most common weight loss question that you get?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So my PhD was in carbohydrate metabolism. And then during my PhD, I got involved in, I guess, a company called Metabolic Medicine, where our focus was on weight loss, helping people manage their weight and improve their lives. So it's a question that came up a lot. And probably the biggest question I used to get was, how can I lose weight without sweating or taking any supplements? And it was always one of those that we'd smile at and just, we'd just talk about the fact that it does require change and it is hard.
I want to read you a stat. The obesity rates in Australia currently are over 30%, and in the US, they're over 40%. Now, compare that to 30 years ago in 1994, 1995. The obesity rate in Australia was at 9% and in America, 14.4%. Why?
Yep. Yeah, look, and this is obviously something that a lot of scientists have been debating for a long time. So we know genetics hasn't changed that rapidly over that time frame. So it's obviously something to do with our lifestyle. Now, there are times, and now and again, you may hear people talk about things like epigenetics, which is a little bit about how our environment interacts with our genes. So there's certainly something that could still contribute to this overall sort of increase in what we see in terms of this pandemic, I guess, of overweight and obesity. But the reality is we're more sedentary. Our lives have become more sedentary. If I think about the options we have in terms of sitting at home, our options have increased exponentially in terms of sedentary behavior. So I can sit down, I have 3,000 movies I can watch, I have any TV series I want to watch. So all of the changes that we see in our lifestyle have sort of driven us towards being more sedentary. And then obviously we have access to foods. We live in Australia, we have access to great food, abundance of food, and it's easy to, access that food. One of the differences between Australia and the US is probably that our food is still, people often talk about clean food. So I would say a lot of the food options we have here are often still low fat and generally quite healthy. I would say what's driven in Australia is more around just excess calories and sedentary behavior. In the US, it's probably both of those, but I think the US is a little bit different in that a lot of the excess calories is probably due to a higher proportion of fat within the foods that they consume. Although I think that's probably changed over the last 5 to 10 years where people are generally shifting or trending back towards eating cleaner. You can see that in social media, people often talking about that.
You spoke about the different types of food between America and Australia. Would something like fast food still be differential between Australia and America? Would a Big Mac in Australia still be healthier than one in America?
Look, that's a good question. And I'd probably slightly outside of my realm of expertise, but I would say that a lot of the produce is locally sourced. I believe from a lot of the franchises. I certainly know with the other franchise it is. I'm not so sure about McDonald's, where I do know a lot of it is distributed from a central sort of place. But my sense would be yes. So if I think about the broad fast food industry, I would think that a lot of the foods that are used to generate fast food is probably locally sourced. One of the benefits we have here is that we have a lot of dairies, a lot of farmers doing exceptional work down in the southwest. It's all grass-fed, and they're walking around in large sort of areas where my understanding is it may not be the same in the US, where there are often these supersized farms and barns where a lot of livestock may be held, where they're probably not outside as much and probably not moving around as much. So there could certainly be a difference there.
What about lack of sleep? How does that affect weight loss and weight gain?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, and it's a little bit of a snowball effect because we know that lack of sleep can lead to poorer food choices, reduced motivation to exercise, which then feeds back into feeling tired, which often then, we often then sleep or have worse sleep. Unfortunately, as we also gain weight, obviously weight gain is associated with poorer sleep. So we have, people who may suffer from sleep apnea and other sort of associated conditions that can often lead to just poorer sleep. I would also say that society generally, there's probably more stresses associated with society currently. There's a lot of pressure. We have a great opportunity to work from home. We have a great opportunity to work remotely. With that comes a lot of responsibility. So in my line of work, I have great flexibility, but that also means that I'm available a lot more. So it's not going into the office working 8 till 5 p.m. It is being at home. It is working from home on days that I want to work from home, but it also means that I'm constantly available for work. So I can be contacted at 6 p.m., 7 p.m., 8 p.m., weekends. So often the boundary between work and home has blurred a little bit. So often you probably have a few more stresses at home because work is brought back into the home. And obviously stress impacts our sleep. And sleep we know is associated with metabolic dysfunction. If we don't have adequate sleep or if we disrupt our sleep rhythms, that can lead to poorer metabolic function.
How do genetics play into it? There's a lot of people that say it's my genetics as the reason I'm perhaps larger than this other individual. How true is that?
Yeah, so we definitely know genetics plays an important role. What's debated is how important that role is, but genetics is something that we're handed, and probably the biggest thing I would say is that some people just gain weight faster than other people. And that's just the fact. So the attribution of genetics varies. It's somewhere above 20%. But whether that's at 70% or 40% is still a little bit debated. We know from earlier research on twin studies that that genetics played a really important role. Now, it does also predispose us. So some people, what I would probably say is there's two things when you think about genetics. There's, I guess, monogenic based obesity, and then there's polygenic based obesity. So if you think about genetics, there are some rare conditions where we can attribute weight gain to one gene, and it's very obviously one gene that's disrupted. That gene encodes for a specific protein, and because of the change in that protein, I have an increased likelihood of obesity, and in fact, in some instances, can't escape it. Then we have polygenic obesity, which is much more common. This is where we'll get some changes in our genome. That means it changes a number of proteins. Some of these proteins may be appetite suppressants. It may be related to metabolic pathways. And this is often distributed throughout the body. And it's harder to map back to identify how much these have contributed towards my weight gain. But we certainly know that genes play a role, and it can be anywhere from a single change to many changes that just predisposes us to weight gain. So if you and I are in the same environment, I may have much more likelihood of gaining weight. And when we talk about the very high BMI, so individuals over BMI of 50 or 60, we definitely know genetics has played a significant role there.
So it's not one size fits all. And these content creators that are coming on here going, you just need to eat less, isn't always factually correct.
No, and the reality is eating less. I know people throw that statement out there, but it's easier for some people than other people. You know, a lot of individuals may have other things going on in their life where, when we eat, it activates something called the reward center in our body. It makes us feel good. And there are times where, excess eating may be associated with our moods and our mood state. So, but for some people, it's a lot easier to just simply eat less than other people. Some people just have a stronger drive and desire to eat than others. And we have to understand that and acknowledge that.
Speaking of weight loss, explain to me the main types of surgeries performed.
Yeah, so good question. So at the moment, or surgeons will perform a few different types of surgery. So the primary means is I guess, can be split across two different areas. One is to reduce the capacity of the stomach, so to minimize how much food can enter the stomach. The second is to bypass part of our intestine, specifically the small intestine, so that there's less opportunity for food to be absorbed from the intestinal canal. So when you think about surgery, it's really important to remember that when you take food into the mouth, it hasn't entered the body yet. It is entering the mouth. It gets transferred or taken down into the stomach. It then transports or moves, transits throughout the small intestine into the large intestine, and whatever the body doesn't take out, we excrete in feces. If we minimize the size of the stomach, it means I can only consume a certain amount or certain volume of food per sitting. If I eat more food, then it means I'm going to end up being sick and I'll end up vomiting that food out. So I have a limited capacity in terms of how much I can take in. If I bypass part of the small intestine, there's less sort of surface area over which I can absorb the nutrients that I take in, including the macronutrients, which are your carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. These are the ones that give our body energy, essentially. So that means that I'm going to absorb less energy and therefore take less energy into the body. Surgeries are designed to either do one by restricting the stomach size or by bypassing that small intestine.
What do they remove in the bypass?
So when they do the bypass, they are creating a little opening in the stomach and creating a diversion where they're essentially putting in a channel in which you can now re-enter the small intestine a little bit further down, so more in the distal small intestine, so that you've bypassed that first part, that I guess the proximal part of the small intestine. Now, one thing that we know is that we have different receptors and transporters at different stages of the small intestine. So often if we do bypass part of that small intestine, we may lose out on some of the important micronutrients that we really need from our food. But surgeons have now got it down pat, and they've played around with a lot of different types of surgeries. And I would say most gastrointestinal surgeons or bariatric surgeons really are aware of the pros and cons of this and provide really strong advice. I mentioned earlier on that I started working at a metabolic medicine, which was around 2001, 2002. And surgery was really probably it had been done for a long time, but was emerging at that stage. But really now I think it's evolved to a point where they've quite aware of the pros and cons, and people get really significant weight loss with it.
Mm-hmm. So we've spoken about a bypass and removing part of the stomach or a sleeve. Talk to me about an adjustable gastric band. You've in the past used an example of someone going on to a cruise.
Yep.
What is that?
Yeah, so the adjustable gastric band is essentially a band that sits around the stomach. You can inject saline into it or remove saline to open it up or close it off, so that it slightly improves the capacity or reduces the capacity of the stomach. So it is something that can be adjusted. It is still surgery, and while it can be adjusted, it is still a significant intervention, and it is an invasive sort of intervention for weight loss. But people have the capabilities of opening it up or closing the stomach pouch down, or reducing the size of the stomach pouch if they have something that may come up. And I have in the past had experiences with patients who may have a wedding or a cruise coming up where they do want to take some saline out. They want to open it up because they want to enjoy food. The weight loss data on those is not strong. It was a very popular choice, I would say, back in the early 2000s. But my understanding now is most bariatric surgeons will probably steer people towards a sleeve, which has shown much more significant weight loss.
I'm just currently looking for an article that I saw earlier, but it was saying that people who go through these sort of weight loss surgeries are significantly higher in leading to depression or even to suicide. I think it was 40 to 70% more likely.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so look, that's a really important question. So in Australia, we have a mixed healthcare system. So we have the public system and the private system, and the guidance on whether somebody should be proceeding with a surgical intervention is around having tried other forms of weight loss. So people had to have demonstrated that they've tried lifestyle interventions. They may have tried medications over a long period of time. Mood is something that's screened out. So it is something that is critical, and it's something that all surgeons would try to sort of, I guess, screen out prior to undertaking surgery. Unfortunately, rates of low mood are higher in individuals who are overweight and obese. So we see 25% from last check that I've done of low mood or depression in individuals who are overweight. Individuals who are overweight and have low mood are more likely to progress to obesity by BMI standards, and often also have additional complications, because part of the concerns around low mood is that you often disengage with your health care. So individuals who may develop, for instance, pre-diabetes, may not engage as much with the healthcare system. They may, if a GP has advised them, take metformin or another type of drug in terms of preventive, because they can see progression towards type 2 diabetes. People with low mood are less likely to continue with that regime or continue that. So they are more likely to, I guess, more rapidly increase weight. So my sense would be, despite the fact that many or all surgeons, and the advice is that that this is screened out, mood is, I remember somebody explaining to me, like it's like the seasons. We have summer, autumn, spring, winter, and there are times where people have low mood, and then there's times where people's moods is fine. And there is an element of that, and obviously these are all questionnaires. And my sense is that there's probably a number of individuals who do proceed to bariatric surgery who have been screened but may have gotten through the screening for that reason.
Mm-hmm. I suppose as well, another way to look at it is overeating or consuming mass amounts of food, being sedentary, it almost is a coping mechanism.
Yes.
People who, come home from a stressful day of work, perhaps working at home, going straight to the sofa, eating, not exercising, that may be their coping mechanism. And then when that's taken away from them and they're no longer able to eat the amount they were previously able to, perhaps that can lead to a spiral of depression as well. You're taking away their coping mechanism.
Yep. No, look, and I think you're spot on. I think that's a good point. Yeah.
How does Ozempic work?
Ozempic is obviously, the drug that everybody's talking about. And look, I'm an exercise physiologist, so I'll always describe lifestyle-based medicine. The reality is Ozempic is a very clever drug. So if you think about weight loss, we talk about intensive therapies, and surgery is an intensive therapy. It's invasive. It's all of the things. It's had a lot of people be very negative about it, but the reality is surgery has it's got exceptional outcomes. Weight loss, when you compare it to lifestyle only, it was much more superior, and across multiple studies that's been demonstrated. Medications have always sort of sit in that middle sort of arena. And historically, there's been medications that have come out in the 60s all the way through. Look, historically, weight loss medications have not been good. There have been more drugs that I can think of that have entered the market and have had to have been pulled off the market. And and that's been over the last 50 years or so. And even with the drugs that have been used extensively in Australia and America, across the world, weight loss has been, about the same as what you see with a diet and exercise intervention. It really hasn't been any greater than that. And then in the last few years, we've seen Ozempic come out. So what is Ozempic? Ozempic is, I guess before I talk about Ozempic, the other thing I wanted to mention is that historically a lot of these drugs have been drugs that are based on other medicines. So it may have been amphetamine-based derivatives and things like that, where we know it speeds up metabolic rate and also suppresses appetite to a degree. And I guess the key has really been, or the holy grail has been, using peptides that the body releases naturally and being able to use those. And we have a number of those peptides that suppress appetite. There's one called PYY336 that was shown to be really beneficial around a decade ago. GLP-1 is one that's been shown to suppress appetite. GIP is another one which is very similar to GLP-1. I'll talk about GIP in a minute, but that's another one. And all of these peptides are released from the intestinal tract, and there's a couple that are released from the stomach as well. So when the stomach distends, We release certain peptides. When the small intestine receives macronutrients in the form of protein, fats, and carbohydrates, it releases a bunch of signals. And these are what I'm talking about here. So when I'm talking about this PYY and GLP-1 and GIP, I'm talking about signals that are released from the small intestine. And their purpose is to let the brain know that food is about to come. And it's very clever because, in essence, it's coupled with how much of each food there is. So if I've eaten a large proportion of protein, carbohydrates, and fats, I release more of these peptides from the small intestinal tract. That sends a signal to my brain to let me know that, hey, this is the amount of energy that's coming in, and hence I can now, stop eating because I'm about to fill up my fuel stores. And it's a really nice system. The challenge with a lot of these peptides, like GLP-1 in particular, is it doesn't last very long. So once it's released from my small intestine, within 2 minutes, 50% of it's gone. It's just chopped up really quickly. So there's been a sort of desire within the pharmaceutical arena to figure out different ways in which we can release these peptides and keep them circulating for longer. Very early on, there was exenatide was one that was used. Exenatide isn't released from the human; it actually comes from a type of lizard. But this particular peptide can still attach itself to the same receptor as what GLP-1 attaches itself to. So it has the same or a similar effect to what our natural GLP-1 has. The benefit of exenatide was that it could circulate for longer, would be circulating for hours, for instance, rather than just a couple of minutes. There are a few concerns around exenatide early on because it was sort of revving up the pancreas a little bit, and there was a thought that maybe it was increasing the risk of developing pancreatitis, which is a very serious complication.
What is pancreatitis?
Pancreatitis is inflammation of the pancreas. And essentially what was happening is that the thought was that these peptides were docking to the pancreas, increasing the metabolic rate within the pancreas. And obviously the pancreas doesn't really like revving up. Muscles are fine. They can be revved up as much as you want. Other organs don't love being revved up too much. The reality is the evidence, it may have increased some of these risks, but and it still has the warning on the side of the package. So that was sort of historically. But now fast forward, and now we have Ozempic. And what is Ozempic? So Ozempic is essentially that GLP-1 molecule with 2 or 3 modifications, in fact, 3 very clever modifications. The first modification being that the part that exposes it to being broken down really quickly is modified, so that when you just modify that part, this GLP-1 can still have its action. So it still docks into its receptor. So it still has the right shape. It attaches to its receptor, but it cannot be broken down, or it isn't broken down as rapidly by the thing in the blood that normally breaks GLP-1 down, which means that it just circulates for a lot longer. A second modification is they've changed the part that actually docks into the receptor, making it a little bit more potent than the normal GLP-1, which is very clever. And then the third is that they've added a little bit of a side, what we call a side chain, which means it can attach to albumin. So what's albumin? Albumin's a protein in the blood, and it essentially acts like a taxi for many things that want to move around in the bloodstream. And the benefit of it is that this Ozempic can come into the bloodstream. It can attach itself to albumin. And once it attaches itself to albumin, it stays attached for a while and then eventually falls off to do what it's supposed to do. But while it's attached to albumin, it's safe. It circulates around. So all of a sudden, what pharmaceutical companies have been able to do is they've been able to take a peptide, make a few modifications, which means that rather than lasting 2 minutes, it now has a half-life of days, so 7 days. You only need to inject it every 7 days. It's maintained its potency, and in fact may actually be more potent than GLP-1. And it seems to be working quite well. So people, that the weight loss studies seem to suggest that it's actually doing quite a nice job.
You said you wanted to speak about GIP.
Yeah.
How does that compare?
Yeah. So So GIP is sort of the other peptide, and often we couple GLP-1 with GIP, and the reason these two are often coupled together is that they play really important roles in helping to, regulate appetite. But the other really important thing is it helps the pancreas release insulin a lot easier. So if I'm an individual whose pancreas is starting to show dysfunction, or the pancreas is needing to work a lot harder because I'm starting to develop some resistance to insulin, GLP-1 and GIP are two peptides released from the small intestine that enable the pancreas to release insulin a lot easier. So these two are called incretins. They both have appetite suppressing effects as well. So GIP is another one of these peptides that has appetite suppressing effects. Why is it important? Well, they seem to actually be somewhat additive or facilitative. So there are new drugs coming out now that are now coupling these two. So it's not just the GLP-1, but also GIP. And these appear to be having greater weight loss effects. And when we're talking about weight loss effects, GLP or Ozempic, it's somewhere in the order of 10 to 15%, with some people losing up to 20%, others losing 5% of their weight. And the reality is a very large proportion of individuals are losing 5% weight loss. So, we often talk about responders and non-responders. Many people are responders to Ozempic.
This comes back down to the genetics that we were speaking about earlier.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it is this sort of responder, non-responder. So some people may not respond to Ozempic, so it may not be for everyone. But now if I also add GIP into the mix, early data from the RCT seem to suggest that the weight loss is probably closer to 10 to 20%. So with some individuals creeping above 20%. So we're now getting into the realm of similar to bariatric surgery. So all of a sudden, where we've always talked about it's either lifestyle or surgery, with medications sitting somewhere in the middle, but generally not working that well for the very large proportion of individuals. Medications are starting to emerge as a real option. And this will be interesting to see what happens with surgical rates, because I'm sure you've probably noted in some of your background reading that rates of surgery have really increased a lot in bariatric surgery around the world. So it'll be interesting to see how that shifts, and I suspect that may drop a little bit.
Do we know yet if there's any long-term health concerns with these medications? You mentioned pancreatic, pancreatitis
Yep.
earlier. Does Ozempic link to any of these? Is that showing up anywhere at the moment?
It's not at the moment. I must admit, I'd assumed that it would because of a lot of the earlier drugs that had sort of come out, but the data is not showing it. And there's been a lot of research that's been done. And look, a lot of this research it's independent research now, where 20 years ago it was very much pharmaceutically funded research. And I know people are often can be quite skeptical of science and scientists, with things that have happened. But the reality is the way that these sorts of larger trials are now run is they're generally supported through other means. And often it's government-funded means, and there'll be people that go, well, governments, they're lobbied by pharmaceutical companies and all those sorts of things. But it is one of those. It is something that we do need to research this, and these trials are really expensive. When you're talking about 17,000 people, you're taking blood samples and things like that. Unfortunately, these trials do run into the $6 to $10 million, $15 million just to assess all of the outcomes. And it does have to be funded in some means, and generally governments will fund it. But if we look across the world, there's been a lot of government-supported studies that have looked at this, and there is still some discussion in forums around pancreatitis, so this inflammation of the pancreas, and there is a risk. The risk doesn't appear to be more than placebo. And we're talking less than 1%. I think the last data I saw was about 0.1 to 0.2% of individuals. So that doesn't mean it won't happen. So if we think about, 2 in 1,000 individuals, for instance, and that is a serious complication. So it is something that people do need to be aware of and probably should track. because for those two individuals, that they are real individuals that would have complications associated with it. And if you think about the number of people on Ozempic, it's anything more than zero is not a non-significant number. So it's important to sort of follow up, but it is actually fairly low. And even when you look at some people who are taking the placebo, we still see some pancreatitis, because people who are enrolling into these studies are generally high BMI. They have other complications, metabolic complications, and it is something that does happen in the population.
So we obviously just described some of the kind of pullbacks of Ozempic. There's not a lot at the moment, but like you said, it's funded perhaps sometimes by people trying to sell you this product. Describe to me some of the other potential downsides to purely relying on weight loss drugs or weight loss surgeries.
Yeah, so this is it's a good segue into the importance of exercise as part of this. So, and again, I've been in this field for longer than I care to remember, I think sometimes, but I would say as an exercise physiologist, somebody who advocates for exercise as often and as much as I can, I've been heartened by the work of GPs, endocrinologists, all the specialist physicians, where they have always emphasized the importance of combining this with exercise. So I would say more important, and where I guess exercise specialists such as yourself will come into the role here is really thinking about the type of exercise. So, when we think about weight loss, what Ozempic will do is will suppress your appetite. So you will not have that desire to eat. So you'll be able to get through the day easier without snacking, without taking those excess calories. But it will not build muscle. We know that a lot of individuals taking Ozempic, the average age is probably in and around that 35 to 45. All individuals will be taking it across the lifespan. But the reality is we probably center it around the 40 to 45-year-old sort of bracket. And the reality is we are atrophying. As we get older, if we don't exercise, we lose muscle mass. So if we think about the type of exercise that we combine with Ozempic, it is critical to think about, the type of food that you're consuming. If you're consuming less food, ensuring it's clean, ensuring you're getting the protein required. Government regulations, guidelines will say a minimum of 0.8 grams per kilo body weight. So if you're 100 kilos, that will be 80 grams. That is the absolute minimum. The reality is we probably want you somewhere around 1 to 1.5 grams, probably you're close to 1.5 grams, especially if you're having some weight loss, which is induced through Ozempic or any other type of med. So that's now 100 to 150 grams of protein for an individual who's 100 kilos. That takes planning. So anybody who is thinking about Ozempic or who's taking Ozempic really does need to think a little bit about their diet, and talking to a dietitian would be really helpful here, and planning on how to get the protein intake, and then thinking about the type of exercise that you're performing. So aerobic exercise is really critical for weight loss, but if you're consuming less calories, I would probably shift the emphasis more towards resistance training to retain the muscle mass.
Yeah, resistance training obviously being within the gym.
Yeah,
lifting heavy things.
Lifting heavy things, whatever you find, and trying to build that muscle up, because that is really critical for also maintaining your metabolic rate and things like that, and overall metabolic health.
I hadn't thought of it in the way that obviously your appetite gets suppressed. I obviously know that you need to have proper nutrition, you need to have proper exercise, but I hadn't actually thought of how hard it actually may be to get that much protein in to maintain muscle mass. That's probably quite an issue that they would experience.
Yeah, 100%. And look, I think everybody experiences it, right? Like so I remember, there was a time where I was training a lot at night, and I was often not eating dinner. And then when I reflected on my diet, I realized actually, if I think about my diet, I had eggs for breakfast, but I was nowhere near getting the protein intake I needed. Like I was sort of thinking around 100 grams for me. I sit around 70 to 75 kilos. And, if I have a couple of eggs and milk and a couple of other things, I'm sort of in and around the 30 gram level, and I'm still scrounging around for 70 grams of protein. And it's actually not easy if you're not planning it. So it is something that people do need to plan and think a little bit more about.
there's more to it than just sort of stabbing yourself and getting the Ozempic in. There's other factors that you need to be considered, which I guess is where the education aspect comes from, that a doctor or an exercise physiologist, any sort of allied health should be passing on before they decide to take this pathway.
Yep. And you're right. And the funny thing is, look, you and I, we're sitting in the Australian healthcare system. We're aware of it, and we're very fortunate to be here. And this is where really the healthcare system has shifted here in Australia, where we have a GP, also a general practitioner who's central to it all, that will then work alongside exercise physiologists, dietitians, to help manage this as part of a team care arrangement. And this is somewhat unique to, I would say, Australia. There'll be lots of clinics around the world that have that model, but here we obviously receive government funding, government support for that type of service, which I think is quite unique in the world.
Do you think culturally we're opposed to using drugs for weight loss?
I think a lot of people are opposed to it. And yeah, I would say on the whole, society has always been opposed to it. But I would think it's actually become a little bit more acceptable, and often people joke about it with, I think very early on, a lot of people were taking Ozempic, but wouldn't admit it or discuss it with friends. They would talk about the changes that they've noticed, they've gone to the gym and all of these things. And there was always an undercurrent of, I think they're taking Ozempic, but I think many people probably weren't sort of admitting it earlier on. But I have the sense that's shifted a little bit. Just anecdotally talking to people, I think they're a little bit more open about using Ozempic, but very quickly adding on that they are making a lot of lifestyle changes because, Ozempic it's not revving up your metabolism. It's not doing anything magical. It is suppressing appetite. So it is still, the onus is still on the individual to not eat because, as we've talked about in class, there's a couple of things that can drive food intake. Some of it can be physiological hunger. So I can be physiologically hungry where I need to eat to refill my the stores that are now emptying out. But there's also habit. There's also just cues that we come across. So if I'm walking past a bakery and I smell the bread being baked, I may not have been hungry 3 minutes ago, but suddenly this is increasing my awareness and there's been some really nice studies that have demonstrated that people will still eat, especially if they're sort of mindless, not thinking about it, if they're not mindful or in the moment, they will continue to snack, even if they don't have the physiological desire to. So in a lot of people who are losing weight with Ozempic, they're not getting the cues, but they're also, I guess, adhering to their diet carefully, which is something which is quite important to, I guess, call out.
I think my kind of line of thinking of that is culturally, I think it's becoming more accepting. Obviously, the more it becomes popular, the more it sells, of course, the more people that are going to be using it. But I think, how do you think it affects people that have gone that harder route? I say harder, there's health implications either way. But, someone who was overweight, who's gone to the gym, they've fixed up their diet and they've lost it slowly but surely, done it, quote unquote, the correct way or the naturally way. Do you think that they would then look negatively upon someone who has taken this drug? I guess there's a little more philosophical question and a moral question than a scientific one.
Yeah, look, as you're talking about, I have an illustration in my head of, I would think that person would place themselves on the dais on position number 1, and they'd be standing up there with a gold medal, and they'd be looking down on the person thinking, look, well done, but you came third.
Yeah.
So I think there would be a little bit of that in society. And I hadn't thought about it, but I think you're correct. I think some people would probably add that. It's almost like an addendum. It's look, I've lost a lot of weight. I started and I did it naturally.
Yeah.
I think it would be a little bit of a I think it would be.
It's almost becoming that shift with steroids.
Yeah.
Someone
I
going
was
into
clean.
the gym.
Well,
I did it naturally.
Yeah.
So I'm better than you.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah.
Now, do you know who Dr. Mike Israetel is?
Oh, I've heard the name, yes.
Yeah, very science-based lifter. Probably some of his methods are a bit strange in ways, but he openly admits that he jumped on Ozempic for his last bodybuilding prep. And I believe that he said that he didn't lose his hunger, he lost his appetite.
Yes.
How are they different?
Yeah, look, good question. And I'm glad you brought it up. So when you first wake up in the morning, you are hungry, which means the desire to initiate food intake. So how strong is your desire to start eating? We then have satiety, which is the point at which you stop eating. So, and often, look, it's probably remiss of me not to have mentioned this before, but we know exercise has a really important effect on appetite.
That's what you're famous for.
That's what I'm famous for. In amongst my family and friends and students.
Yes, when you tell us.
Yeah. Only the 18. Thank you for bringing it up.
That's okay.
So look, and it is important to sort of understand that because, and I really hadn't mentioned that before, but exercise is another way in which we can actually release GLP-1 and GIP and a lot of these other peptides that I was talking about earlier on. And what we see is that people remain, their desire to initiate food intake stays the same, and it's hard to shift that. What we see though is that people have they reduce their desire to continue eating, so they're more sensitive to their appetite. So what it means is if I get a group of individuals into a room and I give them a bowl, and it might be oatmeal, and you eat and eat and eat, and then eventually what will happen is you'll stop eating. And what we find with these Ozempic, what we've seen in our exercise-based trials is that people become more sensitive. So they stop eating earlier. So they may not have that additional 2 or 3 or 4 mouthfuls. And this is a fairly robust finding that people see. So no, thanks for bringing that up. That is an important distinction. So people do still want to initiate food. They still have the desire to eat, but they just stop earlier, which may mean, which can be a difference of 100 calories or 400 kilojoules if you sort of break it down.
So that's really interesting. So can you be on Ozempic, you can be satiated, but you can still be hungry?
Well, you can, yes. So first thing in the morning, you may still have the desire to eat. It's just that you'll eat less and you'll feel satiated earlier, which means that you're just not consuming as much. So all of a sudden the portions are different. And it brings me back to my point earlier in that, it's not a magic bullet. It certainly enables and facilitates weight loss. But if I'm not conscious and I'm just mindlessly eating, I can still push through those extra 5 sort of spoonfuls and just overeat. So people who are losing weight on Ozempic, they are actually sticking to it, and they're probably fairly aware of this. And they are, there's still, it's an element of, it's still not super easy. It just makes it easier.
Sure.
Yep.
Sure. I think the way, I probably didn't frame it correctly, but I think the way that Dr. Mike Israetel kind of quoted it was that he couldn't eat anymore, but he was still hungry and wanted to. But I think because of that, he was being satiated. He physically felt ill eating more.
Yep.
Does that make sense, or am I probably misquoting?
It probably makes sense. And one of the things, and I'll be speculating here. So one of the things we've got to remember is that appetites are really, it's an ancient pathway within the body. It's really important for us to seek food. So obviously humans have been around for a long time, and we haven't always had access to easy food the way we have in the past few centuries. So appetite's a really important pathway. Because of that, there are lots of ways in which we can stimulate appetite and lots of ways that we can switch appetite off. I've mentioned a few peptides, the PYY and GLP-1 and GIP. There's probably another 5 or 6 peptides that can suppress appetite. The body's really clever in that often what it can do is, all of these signals, the way that these peptides work is that they're released from the peripheral tissues, which can be from the pancreas, but most of them come from the small intestine. They transport and travel up to the brain. They attach to receptors in the brain that tell our brain that we've had enough food. Now, if we're getting that from one peptide, but not any of the other 6 or 7 peptides, the brain is clever enough to, 6, 7, excellent.
Just want to see what you pick up on.
Excellent. So the brain can actually start to ignore that. So a lot of the earlier work, and I mentioned PYY earlier, it showed really good appetite suppression acutely. It showed really good appetite suppression for 3 or 4 days, but then people started eating more again. And the reality is, or the thinking was that, look, the brain is now ignoring that particular signal and it's listening to the other signals. And that's essentially what was happening. Now with GLP-1, the signal, or with Ozempic, the signal is potent enough where it still remains. And this is probably what Dr. Mike is talking about, where you're shutting this down and you're sort of, this GLP-1's coming in and it's a strong enough signal to tell me to stop eating, but I still have other signals that are going, no, like there's actually not enough food. And that could be coming from these peptides, could be coming from the stomach distension. It could be coming from other areas like your adipose tissue, which is sending signals off as well in the form of leptin and other chemicals.
Adipose being your fat.
Your fat tissue, yeah. So it could be coming from a range of different areas. So I think maybe what could be happening is that. So it's essentially one signal coming in telling you that you've had enough, but many other signals going, well, actually, no, we haven't, that's not what we're experiencing. The other part is also the social cues. You wake up in the morning, you pour yourself cereal or you have toast. You have the same amount of toast or cereal you have probably for 20 years, and it's just habit. You eat a certain amount, you serve yourself a certain amount, you drink a certain amount. Now, if you serve yourself a little bit less, you probably also have a nagging feeling where you think, well, I don't know if I've had enough. Because if I've always woken up and had 3 pieces of toast, now I'm having 2 pieces, well, actually, there's something missing in my life, and that's that extra piece of toast. So there's probably also a little bit of habit that's sort of creeping in as well, where you're conscious of the fact that you've given yourself less or served yourself less.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say both of those probably play into effect there. And it's an interesting point. I hadn't sort of thought about that, but it is something that we definitely see.
You're probably at more of the forefront of these weight loss medications coming through. You're probably the first that's experienced them. People asking you questions. You're having to teach about metabolics and how the body processes these type of peptides and whatever else. Where do you see weight loss medication in 10 years' time?
I see it just getting better. And look, the other thing I haven't shared is when I finished my PhD, I shifted to Syracuse University, and I met a brilliant chemist there who was doing a lot of the work. And in fact, the first 4 years, a lot of my research was based on working with this chemist who developed orally available insulin. And we used different sort of biological processes to demonstrate the efficacy of this. So trying to make insulin orally available.
Yep. And insulin's what controls blood sugar.
It's what controls, yeah, exactly.
Sugar spikes.
Yeah. So then our next study was actually using an appetite suppressant peptide, PYY, the one I was talking about before, to make this orally available. And we got the drug licensed, we demonstrated it worked, and we did some early sort of clinical work on that. This chemist, Professor Robert Doyle, who's still at Syracuse University, has continued that line of work, and he's playing around a lot with GLP-1 and many of these other peptides that I'm talking about. And really, where I see a lot of this shifting towards is improving efficacy. So what we mean by that is how well it works. And they can manipulate these peptides by attaching to the receptor stronger. And when it attaches to a receptor stronger, it has a stronger effect. So it's sort of, rather than just nudging, changes, it'll kick the cell to, have these changes, and it'll be a much stronger sort of effect. The other thing is, and a lot of users will talk about side effects. So with Ozempic, there's a lot of side effects, nausea probably being the biggest side effect.
I have them written down here.
Yeah.
Nausea, vomiting, fatigue.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So probably the biggest is nausea and vomiting are probably the 2 biggest. And I certainly know that Professor Doyle's team's working on mitigating those, and they've been able to play around with the peptides to change that. The other thing that I see moving forward is the combination of these. So I've mentioned we've got all of these different peptides that suppress appetite. We can often ignore those signals, but what will happen is you'll see a lot more of these combination drugs coming out. And I think it's tirzepatide, I think is the name of the drug that's come out, which is the GLP-1 GIP combination. I think what you'll see are drugs that come out that probably have 3 or 4 of these different peptides that have a more potent effect. They'll probably last longer. We may see changes where you may be on a 28, or you may be on a sort of a cycle of these drugs where it might be GLP-1 for a week and a half to GIP to a PYY to a different, and it may just be different combinations of these drugs just to keep tricking the system. So that's probably where I would see a lot of this work shifting. Longer term changes would obviously need to be assessed. The way that these drugs work, I'm not seeing really obvious long-term side effects. Like, if we think about, we've talked about bodybuilders. So if you think about taking testosterone, exogenous testosterone, that will suppress the body's ability to generate its own testosterone. So often bodybuilders will have to go on a quick cycle to sort of kickstart their testosterone production after they've been taking testosterone a long time. I don't see that sort of feedback loop occurring with these peptides that we're talking about. It's not to say that it won't happen, but I think longer term, this is, I think, where the research will go. And clinically, I think that's probably what their goal is.
And if someone only remembers one thing from this conversation we've had today, what would you want it to be?
I would say that exercise remains a really key component of all of this. The and along with that, probably diet as well. These drugs, surgery, they facilitate weight loss. They make it a little bit easier, but you still need to make the changes. So you're still central to your story, and you still have to make the right decisions. And the right decisions will include planning your meals, thinking about what you have in your meals, and engaging in exercise as often and as intensely as you can, and really engaging with an exercise physiologist or an exercise specialist to plan your exercise session, because it is still critical for longer term health. The only thing that changes muscle metabolism is exercise, and it is the most potent way of changing the way in which muscle works. And a very large proportion of our body is muscle, and it's central to metabolism. Everything that we talked about today, is really keyed around muscle. And exercise is the only thing that directly works on muscle to improve its function in multiple different ways.
Beautiful. All right. Dr. Tim Fairchild, thanks for coming on.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Beautiful. Done.